So I know that I made a slight mistake in giving you your presentation date because Virginia Woolf is supposed to be what we were doing on Wednesday. And I gave you the assignment date as Monday.
Okay.
So rather than making you do your assignments one session earlier and thus robbing you of about a week of work to do on it, we're gonna do we're gonna do Doris Lessing first,
Okay.
and then we'll do Wolf a week from today. That kind of puts things a little out of order, but you know it's my fault. And I don't want to I don't want to make you don't want to make your work due early because I made a mistake.
Okay. So still we do the 24th.
Yeah, your presentation will still be the 24th,
All right.
and we'll still be reading Wolf for that. But yeah, so you're going to be reading Doris Lessing's To Room 19 for next time. And let's just go over the vocab terms from last week real quick, and then we'll try to make this poem make some sense. All right, Bantam unit. What's a Bantam unit?
This was the this was a kind of unit in World War I that they would take the soldiers who weren't like physically equipped to fight and put them all in kind of a unit.
Yeah, good. These were units that were made up of soldiers who didn't meet the Army's usual physical requirements. What's a Bantam? The thing they're named at, the unit's named after? Do you remember?
No.
Okay, a Bantam is a small rooster. And what text would this be most relevant to?
This was Isaac. I remember his first name.
Yeah, this is Rosenberg, Break a Day in the Trenches. And yeah, there's even the passage where he talks about, like, he seems to identify more with the rat than with the haughty athletes around him. All right, who's Miss Ivers?
She was the a character in The Dead by James Joyce.
Mm-hmm.
And she called out, kind of not called out, but I guess she did kind of call him out, but she accused Gabriel of being a West Briton and kind of gave him like a wake-up call. Essentially, that kind of trickled into the end of the story.
Yeah, and the fact that like she speaks some Irish words, right?
Mm-hmm.
She wants to go on a holiday to the Aran Islands in the west of Ireland, and she wears that large kind of Irish-style brooch, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of these are supposed to signal that she's an Irish nationalist. All right. Tell me about voluntary aid detachments, or VADs.
These were the nurses and women who helped out during the World War I that they basically were just trying to do their part where they could to help the soldiers. They also, I'm not sure if this was associated with it, but I do remember it was in my notes, like right next to it was also like propaganda for the war.
They also did some of that, yeah. But yeah, they did publicity work. They did, they ran field hospitals. They ran canteens for troops. May Wedderburn Cannon, who wrote Rouen, was a member of one of these voluntary aid detachments. The other thing that is important about these is this was about the only active role that women were able to take in the war effort. propaganda usually depicted them as kind of sitting by, kind of passively at home, waiting to be
Right.
protected. Or, you know, there's that one with the mother sending her son off, you know, telling him to, you know, go do your bit, lad, right? It's,
Her name was May Weddle.
May Wedderburn Cannon. What's a West Briton, and why is Gabriel Conroy so upset when Miss Ivers calls him one?
It was a term used to describe like British nationalists. I think he was upset because she used it definitely. Miss Ivers used it in a very derogatory way.
Yeah, well, it typically would be. Like, so it's not necessarily talking about British nationalists, but talking about Irish people who are more culturally, emotionally, and intellectually aligned with Britain than they are with Ireland, right? So, you know, to be a West Briton is to be an Irish person who doesn't really qualify as Irish. And she accuses him of this because he writes book reviews for a conservative newspaper. All right. What is Georgian poetry?
This is a kind of poetry that came about during King George V.
Yep. Named for George V.
And it was about like a decade long. I want to say that these poems were released for him, like one every year, a few every year or something.
Yep.
And the style was just like simple traditional poetry.
Yeah, and in particular, like it kind of the missing element of that is that Georgian poetry tends to fuse British nationalism with the celebration of rural landscapes. So we can think of things like Rupert Brooke's The Soldier is a very actively Georgian poem, right? Mm-hmm. And we can see poets like Isaac Rosenberg and Wilfred Owen subverting those Georgian ideas in some of their poems. All right, who is Gabriel Conroy?
He is the dude in James Joyce's The Dead.
Yes.
And he
he's our perspective character
yes.
for all but the first couple paragraphs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And his character, I think, displayed a few different attributes based off of who he was kind of talking to in a way.
Mm-hmm.
With the one girl at the door, I forget her name.
Mm-hmm. Lily, the caretaker's daughter.
Yes.
Yep.
He was kind of, it seemed like very kind of awkward and like just like standoffish after he realized he offended her and then was like, here, take my money instead of an apology. And then I would say, I feel like, I mean, maybe, I guess he was a British nationalist maybe, or maybe not. He was a West Briton.
Yeah, I mean, he's insulted when Miss Ivers calls him this, right? So I think he certainly doesn't think of himself as one. But I think he's also someone who doesn't think of himself as particularly political.
Yeah.
The main thing to remember about Gabriel Conroy is that until the very end of the story, when his wife actually manages to emotionally touch him with the Michael Fury bit, is that he's like kind of a detached observer watching everything around him, right? So Gabriel is very, like, he tends to think of things purely in aesthetic terms. Everything he's looking at, he's thinking about, as if it were a picture. even his memories, he's remembering, the years of his marriage to Greta, right? It's all in terms of like different aesthetic sensations, right? A particular color or scent. And it's only at the end that, when he thinks that, they're going to go back to their hotel room and they're completely in sync and they're going to have the best sex of their lives. And then she breaks down and tells him about this boy she was in love with in Galway when she was a teenager, right? That he realizes that he is maybe not the central player in her life that he believed himself to be, right?
Yeah.
And that is, in fact, Gabriel's epiphany. So tell me about an epiphany. What is an epiphany?
I would say an epiphany. So I know what an epiphany is. I use the word epiphany quite often. I'm not gonna lie, but I looked it up because I was like, what is the definition of epiphany?
Yeah.
And it was one, there was a religious version to epiphany,
yeah.
And then there was also
yeah.
The realization of moral something, and it had to do with morality and stuff. And I was like,
yeah.
I feel like an epiphany is a life-changing realization that changes the entire trajectory of your mindset in your life.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of closest to what Joyce means by this, right? So that the religious meaning, in Christianity, it's the revelation of the divinity of Christ to the three kings, which is why we call January 6th, the Feast of the Three Kings Epiphany as well. In Greek drama, the Epiphany was the moment when a god revealed himself or herself to the protagonists in order to, fix whatever problem was unsolvable in the play. Joyce's definition is a moment in which a character can just realizes the reality of their situation for the first time. And most of Joyce's short stories are built around this process of reaching an epiphany. All right, shell shock.
This was what we know today to be PTSD.
Yep.
However, they diagnosed it as shell shock, which was a damage to the nerves or something, and they thought that it was just recoverable in a few weeks, and then get back out there, and they're scarred for life and shit.
Yeah, they didn't understand it as having really to do with anything physically wrong with you, right? That it was purely, it was purely psychological, and if you couldn't get over it, it was an indication of personal character weakness, right? Not of, the fact that your body had actually been affected by living through a traumatic experience. And Wilfred Owen is treated for shell shock. I think Anthem for Doomed Youth probably, the first half of that expresses pretty well the kinds of situations that would lead one to shell shock. All right, Noleg Naman.
I will let you have the floor.
Okay, so in Irish, Noleg Naman means Women's Christmas.
Oh yes, this was when the men of the house, or the men would do the women's work to give them a break.
It's the 12th or final day of the Christmas season. It's January 6th. This is a specifically Irish observance. In England, this particular day is usually just called Twelfth Night. But in Ireland, it was traditional, for the women of the household to take charge, and for the men of the household to do all the housework. And the dead is kind of structured, like it's taking place at a Nolig Naman party, right? Like, so it's called the Mrs. Morgan's Christmas party, but that's to be understood as this is actually a 12th night at Nolig Naman party. It's not actually Christmas. And it's in a household that is run by women, and Gabriel's in a subordinate position to women throughout the story, right? Each woman he has to deal with kind of has the upper hand. All right, and finally, aestheticism.
This is like, I don't know, I feel like it's kind of taken a turn in like today's society with like aesthetics, and like my generation always being like, oh my gosh, your aesthetic is so good.
Okay, so what I want to know is what this would have meant around the turn of the 20th century. That's what I'm most interested in here, right? So Gabriel is an aesthete, right? So he's someone who's interested in pursuing these isolated moments of intense sensory experience. And aestheticism is an art movement in the late 19th century that champions the idea of art for art's sake. Right? That art doesn't need to serve any purpose, right? It doesn't have to advance any agenda. It doesn't have to make any kind of argument. It doesn't have to teach you anything, right? The only purpose art has is to be beautiful and to provide you with these kinds of intense sensory experiences. And so a lot of critics and artists who work in this mode focus very intensely on these kind of isolated sensory experiences, much like Gabriel Conroy does.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, like, in large part, The Dead is a critique of this idea of art, right? Kind of arguing that it's too disconnected from life and too kind of detached from the way human beings actually behave with each other. Which is kind of like what keeps Gabriel apart from everyone else, right? He's always seeing things through those polished glasses, and those glasses represent the slight remove, his slight distance from other people. Okay, does this make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, any questions about any of these?
So.
Okay, then let's start digging into T.S. Eliot and see what sense we can make of this. So, what is your best guess, having read this, I imagine for the first time, about what this poem is about?
Which part? I don't know. I mean, I was trying to like actively figure it out while I was reading, and I realized that wasn't really working because I was thinking too much about what's going on instead of focusing on what was being said.
There isn't really a plot.
No.
It's not narrative.
And it's also like a lot of it like doesn't, it like none of it makes, like a lot of it makes no sense to me. Like, I mean,
Uh-huh.
even in some of the things didn't even have footnotes to explain what the hell it meant, and I was
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, no, I don't know that language. There's no footnote for it. That's cool.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I don't. Gosh, I don't know. This was a tough one.
Okay.
I
So,
feel like,
first off, let me say, like, there is absolutely no shame in not understanding.
I know, I was so
this
determined
poem,
I was
right?
going to figure this out and go to class ready, and I was like, all right, no, it's not.
So, if you were to tell T.S. Eliot that you didn't understand his poem, his response to you would probably be something like, good, you weren't supposed to.
Yeah, and that's what I was wondering was,
Mhm.
does this man even understand what he just wrote?
Yes, he does. And people of a certain rarefied education, of a kind that doesn't really exist anymore, would have understood this poem without footnotes when it was first published in 1921.
Right.
Right? So, Eliot, for one thing, comes from a pretty elite background. Right? He's actually an American. He usually shows up in Brit Lit surveys and not in American Lit surveys because he lives most of his adult life in Britain. But he's actually born in St. Louis. And he's Harvard educated. Finishes most of a PhD in philosophy. Basically does like everything but defend his dissertation. Then decides he goes to England before his dissertation defense for a period of study. And then World War I breaks out and he can't go home. So he spends pretty much the rest of his life in England. Never actually defends that dissertation. And at the time he writes this poem, he's working in a bank. Just, counting out people's change and, issuing loans. Things of that.
His brain's like,
Yeah. Like he writes a lot of his best poetry while he's working in this bank. He's doing this job that frankly bores him, for which he feels overqualified and overeducated. So a lot of this is keyed to reference points that other people of a similar background and education would recognize. So there is an elitist component to this, right? This is not a poem that is meant to have mass appeal. Yet it actually becomes hugely influential. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way it kind of sums up the immediate post-World War I environment and art scene. So, do you notice anything about the way the poem is put together? Anything about the method? Does there seem to be like a lot of something that's kind of strange here to you? Let me put it to this a little. To what extent is the whole poem composed of original lines written by T.S. Eliot himself?
A lot of it is coming from like either other people's work or like other sayings or little chants and stuff.
Yeah.
And then those ones I could read, and like the first one, The Burial of the Dead, was was in Wagner's opera. A sailor recalls the girl who was left behind. Fresh blows the wind to the homeland, my Irish child. Where are you waiting?
Yeah, he builds a lot of this out of quotations, right?
Yeah.
So first I'm gonna give you what Eliot himself says about this kind of method, right? Just in brief, and we'll think about what this means. But in an essay on the obscure Renaissance playwright Philip Massenger, Eliot writes the lines, "Immature poets borrow. Mature poets steal." So I want to just kind of sit with this for a minute, think about this, what this means. But the other thing I want to do to give you some sense of the method behind this here, right? So what I have here on the sheet are several quotations from popular songs, from TV shows and movies, from Renaissance plays, from classical literature. And what I'd like you to try to do is take whichever of these you find useful and try to build a poem around it. And you don't have to build it entirely out of lines from the sheet, right? You can kind of interpose your own lines as you see fit, right? But I want you to try to take these quotations and build a poem out of them.
Cool.
So just kind of look through them, see if you can find like a theme in them that you could build something around.
I love that Pink Floyd song. Do you want me to write this right now?
Yes.
Okay.
That is the idea.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be genius, it just.
Okay, because I am not, poetry ain't my thing. So do I use a few of them, or?
Yeah, you just pick a few.
Do I use my own words too, or do I just use a few and put them into a poem?
You can use your own words as well. You don't have to, but you can.
Okay.
That's your option. It's your
And
poem.
do I have to have all the same stanza?
No.
Okay.
No, this is modernism.
Word.
Which again, we'll explain when you finish.
hate poetry.
You just need to get better acquainted with it. How we doing?
I mean, I could be done.
Okay.
I'll just be done.
Okay, this seems like a good place to stop. So what have you got?
Okay. Fed through the tube that sticks in me, just like a wartime novelty. Tied to machines that make me be, cut this life off for me. But how will I ever escape? The tight grasp life won't seem to live. The tight grasp life won't seem to loosen. Squeezing me tighter with every squirm, whispering to me the promise of light. Before the seas and lands have been created, before the sky covers everything, nature displays a single aspect only. Throughout the cosmos, chaos was its name. Is chaos what's been lurking like a shadow, leaving me with no form of true peace? Am I all alone in this feeling? How did everyone escape? And you run to catch up with the sun that's sinking. Racing around to come and find you again. The sun is the same in a relative way, but you're older, shoulder with breath, one day closer to death.
Okay, so I think like Eliot, you've chosen both classical sources, or you've got the bit from Ovid, as well as lines from Pink Floyd and Metallica, right?
Yeah.
So Eliot is doing that too. So he's quoting Dante, he's quoting St. Augustine, he's quoting the Bible, he's quoting Richard Wagner's operas, he's quoting the French poet Baudelaire, right? But he's also quoting music hall songs, the Shakespearean rag, also like the sorts of things that were like part of popular culture in 1921 in London. He's got these conversations, like between, he's got upper class voices and working class voices, right? So all these voices kind of blending together in this poem in what is called a collage. Right? You know what a collage is in visual arts?
Yeah.
You usually have to make them in elementary school, right? Do you remember how to make a collage?
Yeah. You just...
Yeah, instead you cut a bunch of pictures out of a magazine, right? Maybe several different magazines, and you put them together to make a new picture. And Eliot is doing something similar in verse here, right? He's taking all of these bits from poems he's read, from music hall performances he's attended, from conversations he's overheard, from plays that he loves, and he's combining them into single large statements about the state of Europe in the early 1920s. So I think one thing that we need to recall as we're thinking about this is what's just in the rearview mirror in 1921. What major world-shaking violent event is only a couple of years behind, only a couple of years back? Yeah, and then that's followed by a worldwide flu pandemic, right? So this is a poem that's written in a lot of ways like in the wake of disaster.
Right.
And I think that really the key to understanding this poem and the reason for the collage technique is this line near the end, these fragments I have shored against my ruin. So he's not just randomly quoting fragments of things that he likes, right? The idea here is to take what's left of a shattered culture and try to build something out of it that's coherent, that makes sense. And while this may not seem coherent to you on the surface, right?
Knock in the tail.
But there is, okay, so the first thing we're pointing out, there is a method to this, right?
That makes it,
that this is
just
not random.
that alone kind of makes it like, okay, he's not crazy.
Yeah. There is a purpose to all of this. And this is what I wanted to think about this particular line here, is about immature poets borrowing, mature poets stealing, right? What's the difference between borrowing and stealing?
Borrowing, you risk the chance of them not letting you borrow it.
Okay.
Stealing, you just take that shit.
Yeah. Well, I think that's you just take that shit, right? You really like borrowing isn't about changing ownership.
And then borrowing, you have to give it back.
Yeah. So borrowing text for a poet, right? It's about kind of what like insecurity, right? You know, like you're not really taking it and reworking it and making it your own. When you steal from another poet, on the other hand, right? You are actually changing the status of ownership, right? This is mine now, right?
Yeah.
This no longer belongs to Dante or Ovid or Gerard de Nerval or St. Augustine or whoever, right? This now belongs to Mr. Thomas Stearns Eliot. And it means something different. Like, it carries the meanings of the old context with it, but it means something new in the new context, right? So you have lifted it from its original context and put it into a new context. And this new context, right? Like, one of the things that, like, this poem is often cited as a prime example of literary modernism, which is in a lot of ways a response to a kind of changing world. So one of the things that marks modernism is experimentation in form and style. Right, so while the Georgians are going and trotting out old traditional literary tropes, right? You know, they're writing poetry in these very traditional old forms. Modernists are trying to break down these forms, which they see as a straitjacket, and trying to create something new and different, right? So even if they're using existing or older materials, they're trying to present it to the audience in a way they haven't seen before. Any questions so far? Okay. So philosophically, we can locate the origins of modernism in the rise to preeminence of 4 19th century thinkers. So do you recognize any of these names?
Darwin, Marx, and Freud.
Okay, Nietzsche you're not super familiar with?
No.
Okay, we'll get there.
I mean, I'm sure if you told me whatever you did,
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that.
Okay, so tell me a little bit. I know we've actually talked about Darwin in this class, right? When we talked about the Speckled Band. What do you know about Darwin?
He psychology.
No, not psychology. Biology.
That was Freud. Oh yeah, evolution and devolution.
Yeah, Darwin is the proponent of the modern understanding of evolution. He doesn't come up with the first theory of evolution, but he comes up with the first that can actually kind of be proven by the fossil record. And so Darwin argues that instead of having been created in our present form by a loving God and guided by his benevolent hand throughout our history, right? That instead, our present, we were actually came into existence in a different form, and our present form is largely the product of historical and biological accident, with no sort of guiding force or intelligence through it, except survival of the species.
Yeah.
Right? Because those whose mutations made them more apt to survive tended to spread their genes more effectively than those who were not. Okay, now what about Freud? You said you just groaned about psychology. What do you know about Sigmund Freud?
I feel like oh my gosh. I'm so uneducated in any other field that I learned in high school. I don't remember any of it.
That's good. We'll draw it all back out again, right?
I'm not even gonna bother.
Okay.
I do remember learning about it in psychology though. Maybe something to do with like the mind or sleep. Or that.
This is, Freud's theory of mind, right? So do you remember what any of these three terms are? It sounded like that kind of struck a little chord in your brain.
I feel like these were, wasn't this like about like, I mean obviously our minds, but how we like had like on the outside like our identity, like, and then our super ego was like inside, and it was like, oh my gosh.
Okay. I think you're getting there, right? Yeah, the ego for Freud is kind of your conscious mind, right? You know, the self that you're aware of. And it's formed by the push and pull between these two unconscious forces, right? Your id is your kind of basic primal survival drives. So your id is the part of your brain, right, that desires things, right? It wants food, it wants sex, it wants attention, right? It wants all of these things, and it wants them right now, and fuck anything that stands in its way. The superego, on the other hand, is the way you're affected by the weight of social expectations, right? So some people compare it to a conscience. I don't think Freud would compare it to a conscience, because a conscience is something that's really built internally, right? From like an internal ethical and moral code. For Freud, the superego, like, it is unconscious. It's something that is kind of like bubbling below the surface of your identity, but it's built out of social pressure, right? So, you know, why don't we all just take our pants off and run screaming down the hall? Because we know we would be, unconsciously we know we would be socially sanctioned for doing so, right?
Yeah.
And the ego, the conscious self, is formed out of this push and pull between these other two forces that we're not aware of most of the time, but that actually form our personalities. Are you seeing any kind of common thread here yet?
I mean, they all have to do with like the individual one person, I guess, in terms of like each one. Are you talking about between Freud and Darwin?
Yeah.
I mean, both have to do with like, well, one, the human being, I guess, but I mean, I guess not if evolution applies to everyone, but
Yeah, I mean,
he's talking about people.
Okay, keep thinking.
Okay.
And we'll talk a little bit here about Marx and Nietzsche, right? So Marx is concerned primarily when he writes the Communist Manifesto and Capital in the 19th century, right? He is concerned about the way the rise of capitalism, for him, sort of dehumanizes the laboring classes, right? He's concerned about what he calls alienation of labor. Right, the idea being that, you know, if the only thing you own, the only thing you have to sell is your labor power, right? It means that your employer, by paying you for that labor, ends up enjoying all of the fruits of that labor. So the stuff you produce, you don't actually see any real benefit from.
Right.
The other element of this is, the other way in which this is alienating is that modern capitalist labor breaks up traditional communities. As opposed to having, the traditional agricultural community where everybody kind of pitches in at harvest time and at planting time. You have these kind of local celebrations that are built around the seasons. Instead, everybody goes to work, clocks in at 8, clocks out at 5. Although if you're Victorian, you're probably clocking in at 6 and clocking out at 8 in the evening, right? And so you're also alienated from these kind of like traditional forms of village and family life. Now, Nietzsche, coming along a little later, Nietzsche and Marx are two philosophers we don't usually really think of as having much to do with each other. Nietzsche is much more concerned with individuals than Marx is, and his philosophy is a lot more individualist. But the reason Nietzsche is important, the thing I want to cite here is that Nietzsche argues that nothing has any inherent meaning. Right? Nothing in the world, human life, right? There is no inherent given meaning of life, right? Any meaning in your life is formed by your own beliefs or activity. Right? There isn't anything, there isn't a divine hand kind of holding you over the abyss. It's all on you to make meaning out of your life. So, how might this be different from the way people had viewed their role in the world before the 19th century?
I think that a lot of people, I know that there were definitely people who were getting out of religion and stuff, but I think that religion had a huge impact on people, giving them a purpose, and a reason as to why they're there.
Yeah.
And then these ideas are coming out, and I'm sure that they were probably having a connection with this. No, we do have meaning, but
and actually probably not necessarily for the reasons you would think people were having conniptions about this. Not necessarily because of the threat to traditional religious values. Although, I think one thing that's key to this, right? In the book of at the beginning of the book of Genesis, when the world is created and human beings are placed in the garden, who does God place at the center of the garden and say, "You're in charge of all of this"? Yeah. So it's a human-centric view of the world, right? That the most important being on the planet is you, little camper, right?
The man.
Is the man, right? Yeah, but more importantly for our purposes here, human beings, right, are the central actors in the cosmic stage. All of this questions that, right? It questions the centrality of human existence to all of the systems around us. And in particular, it questions whether we even really have any agency in our own lives, right? Are we just controlled by the forces of capital? Are our personalities just kind of the accidental results of our desires being tamped down by social expectations, right? So essentially what these add up to, right, is a general kind of idea of human powerlessness against economic forces, against natural forces, even against our own internal drives, right? So this is a very, very different way of thinking about our role in the cosmos, right? Now, what artists like Eliot are doing is linking this kind of new way of looking at human existence. And after he writes The Wasteland, Eliot actually undergoes a religious conversion and becomes a religious poet, but never quite lets go of some of these doubting impulses, which is what makes him an actually interesting religious poet. But at this point, like, he's thinking about these new philosophies, he's familiar with all these new philosophies, but he's also thinking about how contemporary life and contemporary stories can relate to ancient myth. In particular, fertility myths, right? So one of the most influential books of the early 20th century is by a Scottish anthropologist by the name of J.G. Fraser, and it's called The Golden Bough. The basic argument of The Golden Bough is that human religions originate in fertility myths, usually involving sacrifice, that mimic natural cycles in some way, that mimic the cycles of nature, right? So one thing that he points to is the similarity of myths involving what are called life, death, rebirth deities. And I assume that you can figure out what this means, right? It's right there in the name, right? So he's looking at like all of these different myths in which there's like a vegetation god who dies at some point in the year, probably whenever the fallow season is, right? And then comes back to life to renew the earth whenever the fertile season is. So, a good example of this would be, the Egyptian god Osiris, right? Who, dies when, the period, he dies at some point when the Nile is not flooded, and then comes back to, flood the Nile Valley and make it fertile again, right? Or even like, the Norse god Balder, the Greek Dionysus, even, right, the Christ story, he connects to these vegetation myths. Now, Fraser's theory is one that actually just going to fall apart on close scrutiny. These myths are actually a hell of a lot more different from each other than they are similar. He doesn't seem to have accounted for that. And he also kind of cuts a lot of the corners in the stories in order to make them fit together better. But at the time Eliot is writing, this is a really influential idea, right? And what Jesse L. Weston, following Fraser, does is take and apply this methodology to the Western European Grail legend. So I know we did Percival, the story of the Grail, the Chrétien de Troyes romance in the fantasy class. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how well you remember that.
I feel like pretty good. I remember Percival, his character was in other stuff, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because I remember that. It was just that was the story of the girl, is what you're talking about.
Yeah. And Percival begins, as this kind of like, naive boy, right?
Then he comes up as like one of the best. Because was it in the the Green Knight, or was that?
That's Sir Gawain.
Oh yeah, Gawain.
Except but Govan in Percival, who's having the adventures parallel to Percival, is the same character. So in the story of the girl, Govan is the ideal worldly knight, and Percival becomes the ideal spiritual knight, right? But do you remember a figure?
Yeah.
Do you remember a figure in Percival called the Fisher King?
Yes, wasn't he, he took, or he was either buried, or not buried, but like in the ocean, trapped, or he was the one doing the trapping.
Not
Maybe
quite. So
I'm wrong.
He's the guy.
He was half fish, half man, and didn't he like go?
He's not half fish, half man. He's the king of the wasteland, right? That Percival comes to, and he's when Percival is Percival first meets him. He's fishing in a little boat because he can't walk because he's wounded in the thigh. Now, wounded in the thigh is essentially kind of a euphemism for castrated, right? So, because the king is castrated, the land is infertile, right? The land is waste. And so what Percival has to figure out, which he never actually does because Chrétien died before he finished the romance, what Percival has to figure out is, the right questions to ask at the Grail Feast to revive the Fisher King and bring life back to the wasteland. And so Jesse L. Weston was interpreting this Grail legend, this Fisher King figure in particular, as being related to these vegetation myths that Fraser is talking about. And Weston is the more direct influence on what T.S. Eliot is doing here, right? So, as much as it not initially seemed like it, this poem is built around the Grail myth. And the idea, in particular, of solving the sterility problem of contemporary culture, right? Solving this, infertility issue of culture that can only destroy, that can't produce anything new. By investing it with some, with power from some kind of mythic source, right? And one thing, we don't have a lot of time here, but one thing that I do want to talk about is kind of like the way Eliot discusses sexuality in this, right? And these issues of infertility. There's a particular line I want to point to on page 661 first here, right? He says, "I will show you fear in a handful of dust." Now, when I first read this poem when I was in high school, like you, I had no friggin' clue what any of this meant, right? But I wrote that line all over all of my notebooks because it just sounded really metal. But if we think about this in terms of fertility myth, right? I will show you fear in a handful of dust. What does that mean? What's the fear that's in that dust? Well, what is dust?
Dust is just nothing.
Yeah, it's infertile soil, right? I will show you fear in this handful of infertile soil, right? This soil that will grow nothing. And so much of the poem is dealing with what Eliot regards as misuses of sexuality. Whether it's, kind of like overly libertine behavior, or it's a pretty homophobic poem as well in a lot of ways. The Smyrna merchant, Mr. Eugenides, who suggests a weekend at the Metropole. The Metropole was a popular gay hangout in London. And then he's connected to the Phoenician sailor who dies by water. Like Mr. Eugenides offers a handful of currants, and the sailor is swept away by currents, right? And so death by water seems to Eliot to represent homosexual activity. You die by water, you drown, right? You're not giving the body back to the earth.
Right.
And it's not then kind of sprouting new plant life. And I hope this makes more sense to you now, because
yes.
we were about out of time.
Yes. It's very, man, that's very interesting. All of this.
But yeah, so just so you know that there is actually like there is a method and a plan here, right? This isn't just exactly, yeah.
Slap on the picture.
Yeah. You know, I don't expect you to like the poem, but at least maybe now you grasp what's going on. That's